Have you ever been trapped in a nightmare so vivid, so suffocating, that even after waking, you can still feel its cold grip around your throat? My name is Axel Veridian, and I'm not just any psychologist. I specialize in the darkest recesses of the human mind, where dreams bleed into reality, and the line between the two dissolves into a shadowy abyss. Tonight, I'm going to take you on a journey, one that began with a dream so terrifying, so disturbingly real, that it has forever altered the course of my life. But before we descend into this tale of horror, I need you to do something for me. If you have the courage to continue, subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and prepare yourself for a story that will haunt you long after the screen goes dark. It started like any other night. The mundane sounds of the city outside my window had faded into a distant hum as I drifted into sleep. But this time, something was different. I found myself standing before an abandoned lighthouse, perched precariously on the edge of a cliff, its crumbling stone walls slick with moss and decay. The sky above was a swirling mass of storm clouds, and the only light came from the erratic flashes of distant lightning, casting fleeting, eerie shadows across the scene. The air was thick with the smell of rotting seaweed and something else, something metallic, like the scent of blood. It filled my lungs, heavy and choking, as I took a hesitant step forward. The lighthouse towered above me, its once proud beacon now a shattered ruin, but still I felt drawn to it, as if invisible hands were pushing me forward. The wind howled through the broken windows, carrying with it whispers, low guttural voices that seemed to speak directly to my soul. They called my name, their tones twisted with malice, echoing in the recesses of my mind like the distant cries of the damned. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to wake up, but I was rooted in place, compelled by a force I couldn't understand. This wasn't just a dream. It was a prelude to something far darker. As I reached the entrance, the massive wooden door creaked open, revealing a yawning blackness that seemed to swallow the light around it. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat like a drum, heralding some unspeakable doom. With trembling hands, I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight, as if the very structure resented my intrusion. The darkness was absolute, pressing in on me from all sides, suffocating, like being buried alive. Then, from deep within that blackness, a single point of light appeared, a pale, flickering flame, as if from a candle far in the distance. It beckoned me deeper, and against all reason, I followed. But before I take you any further, before we unravel this web of terror and madness, let me remind you, this is only the beginning. The story you are about to hear is not just a tale of a disturbed mind, it's a warning. Subscribe, leave a like, and remember, sometimes the things we see in our dreams are far more dangerous than we could ever imagine. Because in the world I'm about to reveal, nightmares are not just figments of our imagination. They are doorways, and once they open, there is no turning back. It all began on a night that seemed deceptively normal. As the city outside my window settled into its familiar rhythm, I felt myself slipping into sleep, the boundary between consciousness and the void dissolving. But this time, the darkness I drifted into was not the comforting embrace of rest. It was something far more sinister. I found myself standing at the edge of a jagged cliff, overlooking a churning black ocean that stretched out into nothingness. The wind whipped around me, carrying with it the scent of decay and something far more unsettling, the unmistakable odor of charred flesh. My eyes were drawn upward, and there it stood, the lighthouse from my nightmare, its towering silhouette outlined against a sky that seemed to boil with storm clouds, swirling like a cauldron of malevolent intent. The lighthouse was a relic, abandoned and left to rot, but it radiated an aura of malevolence that seemed to pulse with each flash of distant lightning. The once white walls were now cracked and stained, with veins of dark moss creeping up like diseased fingers, and the windows were nothing more than shattered voids, offering a glimpse into the blackness within. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I stepped closer, each footfall sinking slightly into the soft, damp earth as if the very ground was trying to pull me under. The wind carried faint whispers, too indistinct to understand, yet filled with a tone of malice that made my skin crawl. As I approached the entrance, the heavy wooden door loomed before me, battered and weathered by years of exposure to the elements. The wood was splintered and worn, as if it had been clawed at by countless hands, desperate to escape the darkness within. I reached out, my hand trembling, and pushed the door open with a groan that echoed through the night like the wail of a dying creature. The air that greeted me was thick and oppressive, carrying with it the stench of mold, dampness, and something else, something metallic, like rust mixed with the sharp tang of blood. It clung to my senses, invading my lungs with every breath, making me feel as though I was breathing in the very essence of decay. Stepping inside, the darkness swallowed me whole, the light from outside fading to nothing as the door creaked shut behind me. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat reverberating in the eerie silence that had fallen like a shroud. The walls of the lighthouse seemed to close in around me, the narrow corridor ahead twisting and turning in impossible ways, defying logic and reason. I moved forward, compelled by a force I couldn't explain, my footsteps echoing in the confined space, each one amplifying the crushing sense of dread that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. As I ventured deeper into the lighthouse, the air grew colder, each breath visible as a faint mist in the dim light. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, the floral pattern barely visible beneath the grime that coated every surface. A faint flickering light caught my attention, a single weak flame dancing in the distance, barely illuminating the space around it. I moved toward it, the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears, as if the very walls were alive with the sound of 1,000 heartbeats, all synchronized in a macabre symphony. As I reached the source of the light, I realized it was a solitary candle, resting on an old, rusted metal table. The flame flickered weakly, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. My gaze was drawn to the floor beneath the table, where a dark, sticky substance had pooled, seeping into the cracks of the floorboards. I knelt down, reaching out to touch it, and as my fingers made contact, the realization hit me like a sledgehammer. It was blood, still warm, as if freshly spilled. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted, and I felt a presence behind me, a cold, suffocating force that pressed down on me, making it impossible to move. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body was frozen, locked in place by the overwhelming terror that gripped me. Slowly, I turned my head, my breath hitching in my throat, and what I saw would haunt me for the rest of my life. Standing in the doorway was a figure, shrouded in shadow. Its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, glowing with a dull, malevolent light. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its gaze piercing through me, tearing at the fabric of my sanity. The whispers returned, louder now, clearer, as if they were coming from inside my own head. They spoke of things I couldn't comprehend, dark secrets and twisted truths that threatened to unravel my mind. I closed my eyes, willing myself to wake up, to escape this nightmare, but the darkness was relentless, holding me in its icy grip. When I finally opened my eyes, I was back in my bed, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. But the terror didn't fade with the dream. It lingered, a heavy, oppressive weight that refused to lift. I looked at the clock on my nightstand, 3:33 a.m., and there, in the darkness of my room, I heard it again, the faint, mocking whisper, just like in the lighthouse. This was no ordinary dream. It was a warning, a harbinger of something far more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. And I knew, deep in my soul, that whatever awaited me in that lighthouse was not done with me. Yet. As the days passed, the dream began to bleed into my waking life, its details seeping into my thoughts, invading my every moment. I couldn't shake the feeling that the lighthouse wasn't just a figment of my imagination, but something more. a place that existed in the shadows, just out of reach, yet pulling me closer with an invisible tether. The fear that had gripped me in the dream clung to me like a second skin, a constant reminder that what I had experienced was far from over. One night as I lay in bed, struggling to keep my eyes open, I heard it again. A whisper, faint but unmistakable, like a voice carried on the wind. It was the same voice from the dream, the same haunting tone that had echoed through the lighthouse. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up, straining to hear. But the whisper was gone, leaving only silence in its wake. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew better. The line between dream and reality was beginning to blur, and the lighthouse was reaching out to me, calling me back. I began to notice strange things happening around me, small, unsettling changes that made my skin crawl. Objects in my apartment seemed to move on their own, shifting from one place to another when I wasn't looking. A book that I had left on the coffee table would appear on the kitchen counter, its pages open to a passage about ancient rituals and forgotten places. The air in my apartment grew thick with a sense of unease, as if the walls themselves were closing in, suffocating me with their oppressive presence. One evening, as I sat in my living room, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting across the wall. Too quick to be anything natural. I turned my head, my breath catching in my throat, but there was nothing there. Just the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the curtains. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as a trick of the light. But the image of that shadow lingered in my mind, a dark stain on my thoughts. Sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in the lighthouse, wandering its dark corridors, feeling the cold, damp walls beneath my fingertips, hearing the whispers that grew louder with each passing second. The shadows seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing in the darkness, and I could feel eyes watching me from every corner, their gaze burning into my soul. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, the echo of those whispers still ringing in my ears. One night, the dream took a darker turn. I found myself standing in the lighthouse again, but this time it was different. The walls were closer, the air thicker, and the shadows more menacing. I felt a presence behind me, and when I turned, I saw it. A figure, barely human, shrouded in darkness, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its hatred, its hunger, seeping into my very being. I tried to run, but my feet were rooted to the ground as if the very floor was holding me in place, refusing to let me escape. As I stood there, paralyzed with fear, the figure began to move, slowly, deliberately, its steps echoing through the corridor like the tolling of a death knell. It reached out a hand, its fingers long and twisted, and I felt a cold, slimy touch on my skin, like the caress of a corpse. I wanted to scream, to tear myself away, but I was powerless, trapped in the nightmare that had become my reality. Suddenly, I was back in my apartment, sitting bolt upright in bed, my body drenched in sweat. The room was dark, the only light coming from the flickering of a candle on my bedside table, a candle that I had never lit. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the flame, its flicker too steady, too deliberate, as if it was being controlled by an unseen hand. The shadows on the wall seemed to dance in the candlelight, forming shapes that were disturbingly familiar, shapes I had seen in the lighthouse, in the darkest corners of my mind. And then I heard it, a creak, like the sound of a door opening slowly, deliberately. I turned my head, my breath catching in my throat, and there it was, the door to my bedroom, slowly swinging open, revealing the darkness beyond. I felt a cold breeze wash over me, carrying with it the scent of the ocean, of salt and decay, the same smell that had filled the air in the lighthouse. My blood ran cold as I realized that the boundary between my dreams and reality had finally shattered. The lighthouse was no longer just a figment of my imagination. It had found a way into my world, and it was coming for me. With trembling hands, I reached for the candle, desperate to extinguish the flame, to banish the shadows that danced on the walls. But as my fingers closed around the wick, the flame flared up, burning brighter than before, and the shadows surged forward, enveloping me in darkness. I was back in the lighthouse, back in that nightmare, but this time I knew there was no escape. The whispers grew louder, the shadows closer, and the figure, now fully visible, its face twisted into a grotesque smile, stood before me, its eyes gleaming with a hunger that chilled me to the bone. I tried to wake up, to tear myself away from the nightmare, but it was no use. The lighthouse had claimed me, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that it would not let me go. The nightmare had become my reality, and every waking moment was tainted by the memories of that cursed lighthouse. The more I tried to escape its grasp, the tighter it held on, drawing me deeper into its sinister embrace. Night after night, I found myself back in that twisted place, each dream more vivid, more terrifying than the last. The line between what was real and what was imagined had blurred to the point where I could no longer tell the difference. And then, one night, everything changed. It started like all the others. I found myself standing at the base of the lighthouse, the wind howling around me, the sea crashing against the jagged rocks below. But this time, the sky above was pitch black, devoid of stars or moonlight, as if the heavens themselves had been swallowed by the same darkness that consumed the lighthouse. The air was thick with the stench of rot, and the walls of the lighthouse seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as if the very structure was alive, breathing, waiting. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest, but something compelled me to enter, a force I couldn't resist. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside, the familiar darkness closing in around me like a shroud. But this time something was different. The air was colder, the shadows darker, and the silence was deafening. I could feel the presence of something, someone, watching me, its gaze burning into the back of my neck. But when I turned, there was nothing there, just the endless corridor stretching out before me. I began to walk, my footsteps echoing through the stillness, each one a reminder of the isolation, the madness that awaited me. The walls seemed to close in, narrowing the path, forcing me forward. And then, in the distance, I saw it. A faint light, flickering weakly, like a candle struggling against the darkness. It was the same light I had seen before, but this time, it was different. It called to me, pulling me forward, and despite the terror that gripped my heart, I couldn't resist its lure. As I approached, I realized the light was coming from a lantern, old and rusted, hanging from a hook in the ceiling. Beneath it, in the center of the room, was a figure, no longer just a shadow, but a fully formed being, its face hidden beneath a hood, its body draped in tattered robes that seemed to shift and writhe as if alive. The air around it was thick with a palpable sense of dread, a darkness that seemed to seep into my very soul, chilling me to the core. I tried to speak, to ask who or what it was, but my voice caught in my throat, strangled by the overwhelming fear that consumed me. The figure turned slowly, its movements deliberate, calculated, and as it did, the hood slipped back, revealing a face that was both familiar and horrifying. It was my face, but twisted, corrupted, the features distorted into a grotesque mockery of humanity. The eyes, my eyes, were black pits, devoid of life, but filled with a hunger, a longing that I could feel deep within me. Suddenly the room shifted, the walls closing in, the ceiling lowering, until I was trapped, surrounded by the figure and the shadows that clung to it like a second skin. I wanted to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The figure reached out, its hand, my hand, extended toward me, the skin cold and clammy, like the touch of death itself. I tried to back away, but the walls pressed against me, forcing me closer, until I could feel the figure's breath on my skin, cold and rancid like the stench of the grave. Then, without warning, the figure's face split into a ghastly smile, the skin tearing at the corners, revealing rows of sharp, broken teeth. The smile widened, the lips curling back until the entire face was nothing but a gaping maw, a void that seemed to suck in the light, the air, everything around it. I could feel it pulling at me, drawing me in, and no matter how hard I struggled, I couldn't break free. The whispers returned, louder, more insistent, their words unintelligible but filled with a venomous malice that shook me to my core. In that moment, I realized the truth. The figure wasn't just a manifestation of my fears. It was a part of me, a reflection of the darkness that had taken root in my soul. It was the lighthouse, the nightmare, the horror that had consumed me, given form and life. And as I stood there, face to face with this monstrosity, I knew there was only one way out. I had to confront it, to face the darkness within me, or be consumed by it forever. With every ounce of strength I had left, I reached out, my hand trembling as it neared the figure. The moment our fingers touched, the world around me exploded into light and pain. A searing white-hot flash that blinded me, burned through me, tearing me apart from the inside out. I screamed, but the sound was lost in the void, swallowed by the darkness that surged forward, wrapping around me, pulling me down, down into the abyss. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. I was back in my bed, the sheets tangled around me, my body drenched in sweat. My heart thundered in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I struggled to comprehend what had just happened. But the terror didn't fade with the dream. It lingered, a heavy, suffocating presence that pressed down on me, refusing to let go. I glanced at the clock on my nightstand. 3:33 a.m., the same time, every night. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadow, just a flicker, darting across the wall. I turned my head slowly, my blood running cold, and there it was, standing in the doorway. The figure, my figure, watching me with those hollow, hungry eyes. It smiled, that same grotesque smile, and in that moment, I knew. This was no dream. The lighthouse, the figure, the darkness, it was all real, and it had followed me back. The nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. The days that followed were a blur of fear and confusion, each one blending into the next as the line between my waking life and the nightmare I had been trapped in grew ever thinner. The figure from the lighthouse, the twisted version of myself, had become a constant presence in my life, lurking in the shadows, haunting my every step. I could feel it watching me, its cold, malevolent gaze burning into my back whenever I was alone. Sleep was no longer an escape. It was a prison, a place where the darkness reigned and the horror that had taken root in my mind thrived. Determined to understand what was happening, I began to research the lighthouse from my dreams. I combed through countless records, old newspapers, and forgotten archives, searching for any mention of a lighthouse that matched the one in my nightmares. Days turned into nights as I pored over faded photographs and brittle yellowed pages, the flickering light of my computer screen, the only source of illumination in the darkened room. But no matter how deep I dug, I found nothing. No records, no maps, no evidence that the lighthouse had ever existed. Frustration and fear gnawed at me, driving me to the brink of madness. I began to question my own sanity, wondering if the lighthouse was nothing more than a figment of my imagination, a manifestation of the darkness that had taken root in my soul. But then, just as I was about to give up, I stumbled across something. A single faded photograph tucked away in the corner of an old book, its pages brittle with age. The photograph was grainy, the image barely discernible. But there was no mistaking it. It was the lighthouse from my dreams. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the photograph, my hands trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement. The caption beneath the image was faded, barely legible, but I could make out a few words: abandoned, tragedy, disappearances. I flipped the page, desperate for more information, and there it was, a series of articles detailing the history of the lighthouse. According to the reports, the lighthouse had been built over 100 years ago, perched on a remote cliff overlooking the sea. It had been abandoned shortly after its construction, following a series of mysterious disappearances and unexplained deaths. The more I read, the more the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The lighthouse had a dark history, one steeped in tragedy and horror. The articles spoke of strange occurrences, of lights flickering in the windows long after the lighthouse had been abandoned, of ghostly figures seen wandering the cliffs at night. But what caught my attention the most were the accounts of those who had ventured into the lighthouse, never to return. The reports spoke of an overwhelming sense of dread, of a presence that watched and waited, of shadows that moved of their own accord. And in every account, there was one common thread: a figure, barely human, with eyes like black pits, and a smile that chilled the soul. As I delved deeper into the history of the lighthouse, I uncovered something even more disturbing. The disappearances and deaths had been attributed to an ancient curse, one that had been placed on the land long before the lighthouse was built. The curse was said to be the result of a dark ritual performed by a group of settlers who had sought to protect their land from invaders. But something had gone wrong, and instead of protection, they had unleashed something far darker, an entity that had been bound to the land, to the lighthouse, feeding on the fear and despair of those who dared to venture too close. The realization hit me like a sledgehammer. The figure in my dreams, the twisted version of myself, it was the entity, the curse that had been awakened by my presence in the lighthouse. And now it had followed me back into the real world, drawn to the darkness that had taken root in my soul. I was not just the victim. I was the catalyst, the one who had brought the curse back to life. Determined to find answers, I decided to visit the site of the lighthouse. The journey there was long and arduous, the road winding through dense forests and rocky cliffs, the sky darkening as I drew closer to my destination. The air grew colder, the wind howling through the trees like the wails of the damned. And then, finally, I saw it, the lighthouse, standing tall and ominous against the darkening sky, just as it had in my dreams. As I approached, the sense of dread that had been growing within me reached a fever pitch. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the shadows seemed to move of their own accord, writhing and twisting like living things. The door was ajar, creaking in the wind, inviting me in. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped inside, the darkness swallowing me whole, just as it had in my nightmares. The interior of the lighthouse was exactly as I had seen it in my dreams. Dark, cold, and filled with an overwhelming sense of malevolence. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet as I made my way through the narrow corridor. And then, in the distance, I saw it, the faint light of the lantern flickering weakly in the darkness, just as it had before. But this time, something was different. As I approached the lantern, I felt a cold breeze wash over me, carrying with it a whisper, faint but unmistakable. The same whisper I had heard in my dreams, the same voice that had haunted me for weeks. My blood ran cold as I realized the voice was coming from the lantern itself, the flame flickering in time, with the words, as if the very light was speaking to me. And then suddenly, the whisper stopped. The air grew still, the darkness pressing in on me from all sides. I could feel the presence of the entity, the figure that had haunted my dreams, drawing closer, its malevolent gaze burning into my back. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat, and there it was, standing in the doorway, just as it had before, its eyes like black pits, its smile twisted into a grotesque mockery of humanity. But this time, I wasn't alone. From the shadows, another figure emerged, a man, old and weathered, his face lined with the marks of a life lived in fear. He introduced himself as the last keeper of the lighthouse, the one who had been tasked with watching over the cursed land. He told me of the curse, of the entity that had been bound to the lighthouse, feeding on the fear and despair of those who ventured too close. He had spent his life trying to contain the entity, to keep it from escaping, but it had grown too strong, too powerful, feeding on the darkness within those who came to the lighthouse. And now it had found me. The keeper told me there was only one way to break the curse, to confront the entity, to face the darkness within myself and banish it back to the depths from which it had come. But it would not be easy. The entity was powerful, and it would not go down without a fight. I would have to confront my deepest fears, to face the darkness within me, or be consumed by it forever. With the keeper by my side, I prepared to face the entity, to banish it back to the darkness from which it had come. The lantern flickered, its light growing brighter as the whispers returned, louder, more insistent. The shadows surged forward, wrapping around us, pulling us into the darkness. And then, in the midst of the chaos, I saw it. The figure, the entity, standing before me, its eyes burning with a malevolent hunger. This was it, the final confrontation. The entity lunged at me, its twisted form writhing in the darkness, but I stood my ground, the light of the lantern burning bright in my hand. The keeper chanted an ancient incantation, his voice strong and steady, as the entity howled in rage, its form beginning to dissolve, to fade back into the shadows. And then, with a final, ear-piercing scream, the entity was gone, banished back to the darkness from which it had come. The air grew still, the darkness lifting, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace, of relief. The nightmare was over, the curse broken. But as I stood there, the keeper's words echoed in my mind. The darkness is never truly gone. It lingers, waiting for the next soul to awaken it. And as I left the lighthouse, the sun rising on the horizon, I couldn't shake the feeling that the nightmare wasn't truly over, that the darkness still lingered, waiting, watching, for the next victim to stumble into its grasp. The events at the lighthouse had left me shaken to my core, but they were far from over. The relief I had felt after banishing the entity was fleeting, a temporary reprieve from the darkness that still clung to me like a shroud. Despite the keeper's warnings, I had convinced myself that the nightmare was behind me, that I could return to my life and leave the horrors of the lighthouse in the past. But as the days turned into weeks, it became clear that the darkness had not been banished. It had merely been waiting, biding its time. At first the signs were subtle, almost easy to dismiss as the lingering effects of trauma. I would catch glimpses of movement in the corners of my vision, shadows that seemed to flit across the walls, only to vanish when I turned my head. I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than a trick of the light, my mind playing tricks on me. But the sense of unease, of being watched, never left me. It was as if something had followed me back from the lighthouse, something that lurked just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. One night, as I sat alone in my apartment, I noticed that the air had grown cold, unnaturally so. The temperature had dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath misting in the dim light of the room. A chill ran down my spine as I glanced around, trying to pinpoint the source of the cold. That's when I saw it, a dark shape, barely discernible against the wall, standing in the far corner of the room. It was the figure, the entity from the lighthouse, but now it was no longer confined to my dreams. It had crossed over into my reality, its twisted form hunched and menacing, its eyes, those black empty voids, fixed on me with a predatory intensity. Panic surged through me, my heart pounding in my chest as I scrambled to my feet, knocking over the chair in my haste. But as I moved, the figure remained still, its presence a silent, suffocating force that filled the room. I backed away, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but the figure didn't follow. It simply stood there, watching, waiting, as if it knew something I didn't, something that would soon be revealed. Desperation clawed at me as I tried to make sense of what was happening. I had thought the curse was broken, that the entity had been banished, but now it was clear that I had been wrong. The darkness was still with me, growing stronger with each passing day, and it was only a matter of time before it consumed me completely. In a frantic attempt to find answers, I returned to the keeper, the man who had helped me confront the entity at the lighthouse. But when I arrived at his small, dilapidated cottage on the edge of the cliff, I found the door ajar, the interior shrouded in darkness. A sense of foreboding gripped me as I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath my weight. The air was thick with the smell of damp and decay, and as I moved deeper into the house, I realized with a growing sense of dread that something was terribly wrong. The keeper was nowhere to be found, but the signs of a struggle were everywhere. The furniture had been overturned, books and papers scattered across the floor, and the walls were marred with deep, jagged scratches, as if some wild animal had clawed at them in a fit of rage. But the most disturbing thing of all was the blood. Dark, dried streaks that led from the living room to the small, dimly lit study at the back of the house. My stomach churned as I followed the trail, the air growing colder with each step. When I reached the study, I found the keeper. What was left of him, at least. His body was slumped in the corner, his face twisted in an expression of sheer terror, his eyes wide and unseeing. His throat had been torn open, the skin ragged and raw, as if something had ripped it apart with savage force. But it wasn't just the violence of his death that sent a wave of nausea through me. It was the fact that his body was surrounded by the same symbols I had seen in the lighthouse. The same markings that had haunted my dreams. The symbols were etched into the floor, drawn in blood, forming a circle around the keeper's lifeless body. And in the center of the circle, clutched in the keeper's cold, dead hand, was a piece of paper, its surface covered in frantic, scrawled writing. With trembling hands, I reached down and pried the paper from his grip, unfolding it with a sense of dread. The message was clear. The curse had not been broken. The ritual we had performed at the lighthouse had merely weakened the entity, forcing it into a dormant state. But in doing so, we had unwittingly bound it to me, creating a link between us that could not be severed. The darkness that had haunted me since the night of the ritual was not just a residual effect. It was the entity itself, growing stronger, feeding on my fear, my despair. The keeper had known this, had tried to find a way to break the bond, but he had failed. And now I was alone, with no one to help me, no one to protect me from the darkness that had taken root in my soul. The entity was no longer just a figment of my nightmares. It was a part of me, an inescapable presence that would continue to grow, to consume, until there was nothing left of the person I once was. I staggered back, the paper falling from my hands as the reality of my situation set in. There was no escape, no way out of the nightmare that had become my life. The entity would continue to haunt me, to torment me, until it had consumed every last shred of my humanity. And then, when I was nothing more than a hollow shell, it would move on, seeking out its next victim, leaving behind nothing but darkness and despair. But as I stood there, staring down at the keeper's lifeless body, I realized something else, something even more terrifying. The entity had not just followed me back from the lighthouse. It had brought something with it, something far worse than the entity itself. A darkness so deep, so all-encompassing, that it threatened to swallow not just me, but everything and everyone I'd ever known. I had to find a way to stop it, to break the bond before it was too late. But how? The keeper had been my last hope, and now he was gone, his knowledge lost with him. I was alone, trapped in a nightmare from which there was no waking, and the darkness was closing in, growing stronger, more relentless with each passing moment. With no other options left, I made a decision, one born of desperation and fear, but a decision nonetheless. I would return to the lighthouse, to the place where it had all begun, and confront the entity one last time. I didn't know what I would find there, or if I would even survive the encounter, but I knew I had no choice. The darkness was inside me, a part of me, and if I didn't find a way to banish it for good, it would consume me, just as it had the keeper. The journey back to the lighthouse was a blur, my mind racing with fear and uncertainty. The air grew colder the closer I got, the sky darkening as if the very world itself was conspiring against me. But I pressed on, driven by a desperate need to end the nightmare once and for all. When I finally reached the lighthouse, it was just as I had remembered it. Tall, ominous, its walls cracked and weathered, the air around it thick with the stench of decay. But this time, there was something else, an overwhelming sense of finality, as if the lighthouse itself knew that this would be the last time I would set foot within its walls. With a deep breath, I pushed open the door and stepped inside, the darkness swallowing me whole. The air was thick, suffocating, the shadows pressing in from all sides as I made my way through the narrow corridors, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the entity's presence, stronger now, more malevolent than ever before. It was waiting for me, just as it had always been. And this time, there would be no escape. As I reached the heart of the lighthouse, the room where the ritual had taken place, I saw it. The lantern, flickering weakly in the darkness, its light casting long, twisted shadows across the walls. And there, standing in the center of the room, was the entity. No longer just a figure, but a fully formed being. Its eyes burning with a malevolent hunger, its smile twisted into a grotesque grin. But this time, I was ready. I knew what I had to do, and I knew that this would be my only chance. With a steady hand, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the item I had found in the keeper's study, a small ancient talisman, said to hold the power to banish the darkness once and for all. The entity lunged at me, its form twisting and writhing in the darkness, but I stood my ground, the talisman burning hot in my hand. The moment the entity's fingers brushed against my skin, I felt a surge of power, a force so strong it threatened to tear me apart. But I held on, focusing all my energy on the talisman, on the ancient words of the incantation the keeper had left behind. The entity howled in rage, its form beginning to dissolve, to fade back into the shadows from which it had come. The darkness around me surged, wrapping around my body, pulling at my mind, trying to drag me down with it. But I held on, the light from the lantern growing brighter, the talisman glowing with an intense, otherworldly light. And then, with a final, ear-piercing scream, the entity was gone, banished back to the darkness from which it had come. The air grew still, the darkness lifting, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt a sense of peace, of relief. But as I stood there, the talisman, still warm in my hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness was not truly gone. It lingered, just out of sight, waiting, watching, for the next soul to stumble into its grasp. And I knew, with a sickening certainty, that the nightmare was far from over. The darkness would return, and when it did, I would be ready. Because in the end, the only thing that could defeat the darkness was the light within me. The light I had nearly lost, but had fought so hard to reclaim. The air inside the lighthouse was thick with anticipation, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. I could feel the darkness coiling around me, tightening its grip with every step I took deeper into the heart of the cursed structure. The entity was close now, so close I could almost hear its twisted whispers brushing against my mind, urging me to turn back, to abandon this hopeless struggle. But I knew there was no turning back. The darkness had to be confronted, or it would consume me entirely. As I entered the room where the final confrontation would take place, the flickering light of the lantern illuminated the space just enough to reveal the twisted reality that awaited me. The walls, once solid and confining, now seemed to pulse and shift, their surfaces undulating like the flesh of some great unseen beast. The air was thick with the stench of decay, a foul odor that clung to my senses and made it difficult to breathe. But the most disturbing sight of all was the figure standing in the center of the room. The entity, now fully revealed, its form no longer just a shadowy apparition, but a grotesque, nightmarish being. It stood tall, its body twisted and contorted in ways that defied the very laws of nature. Its limbs were elongated, the skin stretched taut over bones that jutted out at unnatural angles, as if the creature had been forced into a shape it was never meant to take. Its face, or what remained of it, was a horrific parody of humanity, the features distorted and misshapen, as if molded by the hands of a madman. The eyes were empty voids, blacker than the deepest night, and they bore into me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. But it was the mouth that drew my gaze, the wide, grotesque smile that split the creature's face in half, revealing rows of sharp, broken teeth that glistened with a sickening wetness. The entity did not move at first, content to simply watch me with those empty eyes, its smile widening as if it found amusement in my terror. But I could feel its malevolence, a palpable force that seemed to pulse in the air around it, a darkness that threatened to overwhelm me if I allowed myself to succumb to fear. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stand my ground, to face this monstrosity head-on. I had come too far, endured too much to back down now. The lantern flickered weakly in my hand, its light barely holding back the encroaching darkness. I knew I had to act quickly. The talisman in my pocket was my only hope, the last weapon I had against the entity. But as I reached for it, the entity finally moved, its twisted form lurching forward with a speed that caught me off guard. In an instant, it was upon me, its bony fingers wrapping around my throat, squeezing with a strength that belied its emaciated appearance. I gasped, struggling to breathe as the entity's grip tightened, its face inches from mine. The stench of decay was overwhelming, and I could feel its cold, clammy breath against my skin, as if the very air it exhaled was tainted with the essence of death itself. The darkness in its eyes seemed to expand, drawing me in, pulling me down into an abyss from which there would be no escape. My vision began to blur, and I knew I had only seconds left before the darkness claimed me entirely. Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the talisman. The moment it touched the air, the entity recoiled, its grip loosening just enough for me to suck in a desperate breath. I held the talisman aloft, the ancient symbols etched into its surface, glowing with a faint, otherworldly light. The entity hissed, a sound that reverberated through the room like the death rattle of some great dying beast. And for the first time, I saw something in its eyes. Fear. But the entity was not so easily banished. It lunged at me again, its twisted form writhing in the darkness as it tried to tear the talisman from my grasp. I staggered back, raising the talisman higher, focusing all my will on the incantation the keeper had taught me. The words spilled from my lips, ancient and powerful, resonating in the air like the tolling of a great cosmic bell. The light from the talisman grew brighter, pushing back the darkness, and the entity screamed, a sound so terrible, so filled with rage and despair, that it felt as if the very fabric of reality was tearing apart. The room shook violently, the walls groaning under the strain as the entity thrashed and writhed, its form beginning to dissolve, to melt away into the shadows from which it had come. But even as it faded, it fought back with a ferocity born of desperation, its clawed hands reaching out to drag me down with it. I could feel its hatred, its hunger, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I thought it might succeed. But the light from the talisman was too strong, too pure, and with a final, agonized scream, the entity was ripped from the world, banished back to the darkness that had birthed it. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The lantern had gone out, the room now bathed in an eerie, unnatural silence. The walls, once pulsing with malevolent energy, were still, the air cold and stale. The entity was gone, but the darkness it had left behind was still there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the next victim to stumble into its grasp. But as I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, I realized something else, something far more terrifying. The entity had been banished, yes, but the darkness had not. It had merely retreated, hiding in the corners of my mind, waiting for the moment when my resolve would falter, when my strength would wane. The bond between us had not been broken, it had merely been weakened, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that the darkness would return, stronger and more relentless than ever before. As I slowly pulled myself to my feet, I felt a cold, creeping dread settle over me. The talisman had saved me, but it was a temporary reprieve, a brief respite from the nightmare that had become my life. The darkness was still there, still watching, still waiting, and it would never truly let me go. It was a part of me now, a shadow that would follow me wherever I went, lurking just out of sight, whispering in the dead of night. I had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The darkness was patient, and it would wait, biding its time, until the day when I could no longer resist, when I would finally succumb to the terror that had taken root in my soul. And when that day came, there would be no more lanterns, no more talismans, no more ancient incantations to save me. There would only be the darkness, cold and infinite, swallowing me whole. As I left the lighthouse for what I hoped would be the last time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was following me, just out of sight. The road ahead was long and winding, and the darkness seemed to cling to the horizon, casting long shadows across the path. I knew I could never escape it. Not completely, but I had to keep moving, had to keep fighting, because the alternative was unthinkable. The nightmare was not over, but for now the light still held, and I would cling to it with everything I had, because in the end, it was the only thing standing between me and the abyss, the only thing that could keep the darkness at bay. And as long as I had that light, there was still hope, still a chance, however slim, that I could find a way to banish the darkness for good. But even as I held on to that hope, a part of me knew the truth, that the darkness was patient, that it would wait, and when the time was right, it would come for me again. And when it did, there would be no escape, no hiding, no running. There would only be the darkness, and the nightmare that would never end. The silence in the lighthouse was deafening as I stumbled out into the cold, unforgiving night. The wind whipped around me, carrying the faint scent of salt and decay, as if the ocean itself had been tainted by the darkness that had plagued me for so long. The sky above was a deep, inky black, with not a single star to break the oppressive void. The only light came from the distant horizon, where the first faint traces of dawn began to creep in, casting long, eerie shadows across the rocky landscape. But even as I breathed in the cold air, desperate to shake off the lingering sense of dread that clung to me, I knew that something wasn't right. The darkness that had filled the lighthouse hadn't simply vanished. It had followed me, clinging to my every step like a shadow that refused to let go. I could feel it, just out of sight, lurking in the corners of my mind, whispering in a voice so faint I could barely hear it, yet powerful enough to send a chill down my spine. As I made my way back to my car, the wind seemed to carry with it the faintest echo of that terrible, inhuman scream I had heard when the entity was banished. A sound that resonated deep within me, as if it were coming from inside my own head. My hands trembled as I fumbled for the keys, desperate to get away from the lighthouse, to put as much distance between me and that cursed place as possible. But no matter how fast I drove, no matter how far I went, the feeling of being watched, of being followed, never left me. The roads were empty, deserted in the early hours of the morning, but every so often I would catch a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror, a shadow that moved just a little too quickly, a flash of darkness that disappeared the moment I tried to focus on it. My heart pounded in my chest, a steady rhythm of fear and desperation, as I pushed the car faster, the landscape around me blurring into a smear of black and gray. When I finally reached my apartment, the first rays of sunlight were just beginning to break through the clouds, casting a dim orange glow over the city. I stumbled inside, locking the door behind me with shaking hands, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The familiar surroundings should have been comforting, but instead they felt foreign, as if I had stepped into someone else's life. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker, deeper, and the air was thick with a sense of unease, as if the walls themselves were watching me. I collapsed onto the couch, my body heavy with exhaustion, but sleep was the last thing on my mind. The events of the night played over and over in my head, a relentless loop of terror and confusion. I had faced the entity, had banished it back to the darkness, but at what cost? The nightmare wasn't over. It had simply changed, morphed into something even more insidious. The darkness was still with me, growing stronger with each passing moment, feeding on my fear, my uncertainty. Hours passed in a blur, the light outside shifting from the soft glow of dawn to the harsh brightness of midday, but I barely noticed. My mind was consumed with what I once thought how to escape the darkness that had followed me back from the lighthouse. But no matter how hard I tried to think of a solution, the answer eluded me, slipping through my fingers like sand. And then, as the afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon, I noticed something strange. A small, seemingly insignificant detail that sent a fresh wave of terror crashing over me. There, on the table beside the couch, was the talisman. The very same one I had used to banish the entity. But something was different about it now. The once glowing symbols were dark. The intricate carvings, now twisted and warped, as if the talisman itself had been corrupted by the darkness. I reached out to touch it, but the moment my fingers brushed against the cold metal, a sharp pain shot through my hand, as if I had been burned. I pulled back, staring in horror as a faint black smoke began to rise from the talisman, curling into the air like tendrils of some malevolent force. The symbols began to pulse, glowing with a sickly, unnatural light, and I realized with a sinking feeling that the talisman had not banished the entity. It had merely contained it, held it at bay long enough for me to escape. But now, that containment was failing, the darkness finding new ways to seep into my reality. As I watched in terror, the black smoke began to coalesce, forming shapes that were disturbingly familiar. Twisted, distorted versions of the entity, their forms shifting and writhing as they took shape in the air above the talisman. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide from the darkness that was now a part of me. The figures in the smoke turned toward me, their eyes, those empty voids, locking onto mine, and I could feel their gaze burning into my soul, pulling me back toward the abyss from which I had barely escaped. The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent, filling the room with a cacophony of voices that drowned out all rational thought. They spoke of things I couldn't comprehend, dark secrets and twisted truths that made my head spin, my vision blur. In that moment, I understood the terrible truth. The darkness had never truly been banished. It had simply been waiting, biding its time until I was weak enough, vulnerable enough to succumb to its influence. The entity was no longer just a part of the lighthouse. It was a part of me, a shadow that would follow me wherever I went, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the moment when I would finally give in to the terror that had taken root in my heart. I tried to fight it, to push back against the darkness that was slowly consuming me, but it was too strong, too powerful. The figures in the smoke began to move closer, their forms solidifying as they advanced on me, their whispers growing louder, more frantic. I could feel the darkness closing in, pressing against my mind, my soul, until there was nothing left but fear and despair. And then, just as the darkness threatened to overwhelm me completely, I heard it. A sound so faint, so distant that it was almost drowned out by the whispers. But it was there, a single steady note that cut through the chaos like a blade. It was the sound of the lantern, the same lantern that had guided me through the lighthouse, its light still burning somewhere deep within my mind. The realization hit me like a shock of cold water. The light was still there, buried beneath the layers of darkness that had tried to snuff it out. It was weak, barely a flicker, but it was enough. Enough to hold back the darkness, to keep it from consuming me entirely. I focused on that light, that single point of hope, and slowly, painfully, I began to push back. The figures in the smoke recoiled, their forms dissolving as the light grew stronger, pushing back the shadows that had filled the room. The whispers grew fainter, more desperate as the darkness was forced to retreat, to slink back into the corners of my mind where it would lie in wait. biding its time. The talisman stopped pulsing, the symbols fading back into silence, and the room was once again filled with the soft, golden light of the setting sun. But even as the darkness receded, I knew that this was not the end. The entity had been banished, but it was not gone. It was still there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the moment when my resolve would falter, when the light within me would flicker and die. And when that moment came, it would return, stronger and more relentless than ever before. The nightmare was not over. It had merely changed. The darkness was still a part of me, a shadow that would follow me wherever I went, a constant reminder of the horror that had taken root in my soul. But for now, the light still held, and as long as I could keep it burning, there was hope. But I knew, deep down, that the darkness was patient. It would wait, biding its time, until the day when I could no longer resist, when I would finally succumb to the terror that had haunted me for so long. And when that day came, there would be no more light, no more hope, only the darkness, cold and infinite, swallowing me whole. As I sat there staring at the talisman, I realized that the nightmare would never truly end. It would follow me, haunt me, until the day I drew my last breath. And even then, the darkness would remain, waiting for the next soul to stumble into its grasp. So now, I ask you, what would you do if you were in my place? Could you live with the knowledge that the darkness is always there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the moment when you are too weak to fight back? Or would you give in, let it take you, and embrace the nightmare that has become your life? The choice is yours. But remember, sometimes the darkness is not something that can be defeated. Sometimes it is something that we must learn to live with, to carry with us, like a shadow that never leaves our side.